Peter Schiff, 2 minutes.
First, let me just thank you, Christophe, for agreeing to moderate this, and for my fellow candidates for agreeing to participate, particularly Rob Simmons, one of my 2 Republican opponents in the primaries. It's unfortunate that the other opponent, Linda McMahon, apparently did not think enough of Connecticut taxpayers to show up. But I think this is a very critical election because it comes at a very critical time in the history of our republic. I think we really stand at a fork in the road to serfdom. And if we continue on our present course, we will certainly arrive at that ill-fated destination. And it will be characterized by central government planning, a loss of individual liberty, a widespread unemployment, runaway inflation, and a general decline in our overall standard of living. If, on the other hand, we decide to embrace the principles that were responsible for our original prosperity and were envisioned by the framers of our Constitution, if we go back to limited government, to free market capitalism, to individual liberty, to sound money, we can climb out of this gigantic hole that years of misguided monetary and fiscal policy have placed us in. Make no mistake about it. We are in grave danger as a nation, but it's not for the reason Washington wants us to believe. It's not because we didn't have enough government, but because we had too much. The financial crisis of 2008 and the ensuing recession were not the result of a failure of the free market, but a failure of government interference and manipulation of the free market. And I'm not a Monday morning quarterback here. I predicted the problems that we had in precise detail for years on television. And not only were my warnings ignored, but they were the subject of laughter and ridicule. Now the same government that created this problem is telling us that their stimulus is solving it. Their stimulus is only making it worse. We will overdose on government stimulus. If Washington won't listen to me as a private citizen, maybe, just maybe, they'll listen to me as a United States Senator. And I hope with your support, I'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter Schiff. What, if anything, has been done right lately about the economy? What's been done wrong, and what would you do?
Unfortunately, they haven't done anything right, with the possible exception of letting Lehman Brothers fail. The problem is we have serious structural problems that underlie our economy, and they're results of years of misguided government policy. Americans spend too much money; they don't produce enough. They consume too much, or they borrow too much, and they don't save enough. And as a result, we've erected a phony economy based on debt, while our real economy, the manufacturing and industrial component, has been allowed to disintegrate. Unfortunately, the government has to get out of the way and let the economy restructure. If they don't do that, we are in danger of recreating a repeat of the 1930s, another Great Depression, only this time, because we're not on a gold standard but on a paper standard, it's going to be one that's also going to have runaway inflation. And that's going to make this depression far more painful than the one that our grandparents
What do you change about federal spending policy? Where would you spend more, where less?
Well, we have to understand that every dollar the federal government spends is a dollar the private sector can't invest. The government doesn't have any money that doesn't first take from the private economy. And if we're going to grow our economy, if we're going to have businesses, we need capital investment. We can't create jobs without capital, and we don't have capital without savings. And there are no savings if the government is running a $1.5 trillion deficit. The government is borrowing all the savings that we need. So we can't really start growing our economy until we shrink the government. See, the government's got it wrong. Government spending isn't a stimulus, it's a sedative. Right? Our real stimulus is to reduce the burden that the government places on the real economy. And not slashing government spending, but abolishing all the unnecessary rules and regulations that distort the economy, that make us inefficient and unproductive, and destroy jobs.
Peter Schiff. Peter, what would you change about federal tax policy? That is, where would you tax more and where would you tax less?
Well, unfortunately, before we can address taxes, we have to address spending, because the real cost of government is not what it taxes, but what it spends. Right now, the government is spending $1.60 for every dollar it collects in taxes. So we need to slash federal spending before we can talk about tax relief, which I believe we need. But what's the only thing worse than taxing and spending is borrowing and spending, because 100% of the money the government borrows comes out of capital investment, and it hurts the economy more than the taxes themselves. But if we could reform the tax code, I'd like to move away from income-based taxation. I don't think we want to tax people based on what they earn, but what they spend. I'd rather have a national consumption tax, a national sales tax. If we're going to stick with an income tax at all, at least have it be a flat rate, at least have everybody pay the same rate. What I don't like is when politicians promise to tax one person for the benefit of somebody else. If people want more government, then everybody should have to pay for it.
Oh, all right. Go ahead.
It's my 2 cents.
It wasn't that tough, Peter.
Yeah, my 2 cents on let's soak the rich. First of all, when the income tax was 90% briefly, nobody paid it. I mean, everything was deductible back then. It wasn't like the tax code is today. So no one paid that tax. Nobody's going to work for 10 cents on the dollar. I'm a small businessman, right? I provide over 100 jobs. Right now, between the state of Connecticut and federal income taxes, I'm paying half of my income in taxes. If you don't believe me, you can look at my tax return. Right? That's a lot of money. And where's that money going? The money that the government is taking from me in taxes is money that I otherwise would have invested. I would have invested it, like other businessmen, to grow the economy and provide jobs. We don't want to take that seed corn away and send it to Washington. And also, there's something about incentive. You know, if my taxes go up a little bit more, I might decide it's not even worth it anymore. I might decide to retire. I might close down my business and all those jobs with it. And a lot of other entrepreneurs. We can't kill the goose that lays the golden egg.
Iraq and Afghanistan, would you vote to continue appropriations?
Well, I mean, certainly we need to appropriate funds for our national defense. National defense is the most important function of the federal government. I believe defense spending should comprise the majority of federal spending. But that doesn't mean we should spend money unnecessarily. I think we are too involved overseas. I think we are wasting money and calling it national defense. If anything, I think our interventionist foreign policy is undermining our true ability to defend ourselves because we're borrowing the money to pay for it. We're going into debt. We're borrowing the money from China, from Japan, from the Soviet Union, from Saudi Arabia. You know, we can't put national defense on a credit card and think we can defend ourselves. And we also can't pay for it with a printing press. I mean, we cannot confuse money with wealth. Sure, we can print money, but that doesn't create jobs, it doesn't create prosperity, it just creates inflation. And if you don't believe me, take a trip to Zimbabwe and see how that policy is working over there.
Immigration and the Arizona laws.
Well, of course, I'm in favor of legal immigration. All four of my grandparents legally immigrated here from Eastern Europe about 100 years ago. But, you know, we need to have people here legally. And one of the few things that I believe the federal government should be doing, that it's not, is adequately policing our borders and making sure that the people who are in this country are here legally and come here through proper channels. That said, I think we should certainly streamline the process. I think it's a lot more difficult to come here legally today than it was for my grandparents. I think we have to make it a lot easier for people to come here and work and contribute. But I don't want people coming here to take advantage of the social welfare state. When my grandparents came here, there was no Social Security taxes, there was no welfare benefits or food stamps, but they also didn't have any Social Security taxes to pay, any income taxes to pay, either state or federal. So it was very easy for my grandparents to succeed in this country, and the only people that came here were people who wanted to work hard and prosper. So we want to try to recreate that climate today. But I would be against building a wall on our southern border, because I'm more afraid that rather than using that wall to keep the Mexicans out, one day they'll use it to keep the Americans in.